March 15, 1945. The Consolidated B-24 Liberator, Gremlin's Delight, was flying high over the Alaskan wilderness on a scientific mission when the unthinkable happened. Engine number 1 suddenly seized, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the Arctic air. Before the crew could react, engine number 2 began trailing black smoke and oil. In an instant, the 4-engine heavy bomber had become a flying coffin with half its power gone and 14 souls aboard fighting for their lives against the laws of physics and the merciless Alaskan terrain below. This is the story of how prayer, skill, and the legendary toughness of the B-24 Liberator combined to pull off one of the most miraculous emergency landings in aviation history. The Consolidated B-24 Liberator was America's most produced warplane, with over 18,000 built during World War II. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp radial engines, producing 200 horsepower each, the B-24 could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs across a range of 2,850 miles at speeds up to 303 mph. But the Liberator was also notoriously unforgiving. Its high aspect ratio Davis wing gave it exceptional range and speed, but made it extremely difficult to fly on reduced power. Aviation experts called it the flying coffin, because losing 2 engines on one side usually meant certain death. The asymmetric thrust would send the bomber into an unrecoverable spin. Gremlin's Delight was a battle-tested B-24D that had served with distinction in the Aleutian campaign against Japanese forces. Originally built in 1942 at Consolidated's San Diego plant, she had survived countless combat missions over the frozen islands of Alaska's Aleutian chain during some of the war's most brutal flying conditions. By March 1945, with the war winding down, Gremlin's Delight had been assigned to special scientific missions. On this particular day, she was carrying a crew of 14 specialists to observe and photograph a rare solar eclipse, a mission that combined military precision with cutting-edge astronomical research. The crew was led by Captain Harold Morrison, a veteran pilot with over 1,000 hours in B-24s. Morrison had flown bombing missions against Japanese installations at Kiska and Attu, navigating through Alaskan storms that had claimed dozens of aircraft and crews. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Parker, was equally experienced, having survived a previous crash landing in the Aleutians. The scientific team aboard included meteorologists, astronomers, and photographers equipped with specialized cameras and instruments to record the eclipse. For them, this was the chance of a lifetime, a perfect vantage point to study one of nature's most spectacular phenomena. At 0830 hours, Gremlin's Delight lifted off from Ladd Field near Fairbanks, Alaska, bound for the eclipse observation point over the Yukon Territory. The weather was clear and cold, perfect conditions for both flying and astronomical observation. The 14-man crew was in high spirits as they climbed toward their cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. For the first 3 hours, everything went according to plan. The scientific team was busily setting up their equipment, taking baseline photographs and measurements as the shadow of the moon began its approach across the Earth's surface. Captain Morrison kept the big bomber steady and level, providing the stable platform the scientists needed for their delicate work. Then, at 11:34 hours, disaster struck without warning. Engine number 1, the outboard engine on the port wing, suddenly began vibrating violently. Within seconds, the vibration became so severe that it threatened to shake the entire aircraft apart. Morrison immediately reached for the engine controls, but before he could shut it down properly, the engine seized completely. The massive 4-blade propeller stopped turning and began windmilling in the slipstream, creating enormous drag that pulled the bomber to the left. Morrison fought the controls, applying full right rudder and aileron to keep the aircraft flying straight, but their troubles were just beginning. Less than 2 minutes later, engine number 2, the inboard engine on the same wing, began trailing a stream of black oil and smoke. The engine temperature gauges spiked into the red zone as internal components began failing. Morrison and Parker worked frantically to diagnose the problem, but it was clear that number 2 was rapidly destroying itself. "We're losing number 2, Parker shouted over the intercom. "Oil pressure dropping fast. She's going to seize." The situation was now critical beyond words. The B-24 was barely controllable with one engine out, but losing two engines on the same side would create asymmetric thrust that even the most skilled pilot couldn't overcome. Standard procedure called for an immediate bailout, but they were flying over some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Morrison made a split-second decision that would determine whether 14 men lived or died. Instead of ordering the crew to jump into the frozen wilderness, he would attempt to fly the crippled bomber home on the two remaining engines. It was a decision that defied every rule in the book. When engine number 2 finally seized at 11:42 hours, Gremlin's Delight immediately began yawing hard to the left. The asymmetric thrust from engines 3 and 4 on the starboard wing was trying to flip the bomber onto its back. Morrison stood on the right rudder pedal with both feet, his leg muscles screaming as he fought the tremendous aerodynamic forces. Lieutenant Parker grabbed the controls as well, adding his strength to Morrison's as they battled to keep the aircraft airborne. The flight engineer, Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan, frantically worked to feather the propellers on the dead engines, angling the blades to reduce drag. But the feathering mechanism on engine 1 had jammed, leaving the propeller to windmill and create massive resistance. "We're losing altitude fast," Parker reported, watching the altimeter unwind. "Down to 18,000 and dropping." Morrison knew they had perhaps 30 minutes before the aircraft became uncontrollable. The two remaining engines were running at maximum power, but they simply couldn't produce enough thrust to maintain level flight. Gremlin's Delight was in a controlled descent toward the frozen wasteland below. The nearest airfield was Ladd Field, still 200 miles away. At their current rate of descent, they would hit the ground long before reaching safety. Morrison had to find somewhere to put the big bomber down, and his options were terrifyingly limited. Navigator Lieutenant Robert Chen began plotting emergency landing sites, but the map showed nothing but wilderness, dense forests, frozen rivers, and mountains that could tear the B-24 apart on impact. Radio operator Corporal Danny Washington put out a mayday call, but they were beyond the range of most rescue aircraft. The scientific team, strapped into their seats in the bomber's cavernous fuselage, watched in tense silence as the crew fought for their lives. Dr. Richard Hamilton, the mission's chief astronomer, later wrote that the next 20 minutes felt like hours as they listened to the strained voices of the pilots over the intercom. At 11:57 hours, Sergeant O'Sullivan reported a breakthrough. "I've got number 1 feathered," he announced. With the propeller blades finally angled properly, the drag from the dead engine was significantly reduced. Morrison felt the aircraft become slightly more manageable, but they were still descending steadily. "There!" Navigator Chen suddenly pointed through the windscreen. "That lake? It's frozen solid. We can put her down on the ice." Ahead lay a frozen lake about 2 miles long and half a mile wide. The surface appeared smooth and solid, covered with several feet of ice that might be strong enough to support the 32-ton bomber. It was far from ideal, but it was their only chance. Morrison began setting up for the most difficult landing of his career. He had to approach the frozen lake at exactly the right speed and angle. Too fast, and they would break through the ice and sink. Too slow, and they would stall and crash. He had never landed a B-24 on ice, and the aircraft's tricycle landing gear wasn't designed for such conditions. "All stations, prepare for emergency landing," Morrison announced over the intercom. "This is going to be rough." The crew and scientific team braced themselves as Gremlin's Delight descended toward the frozen lake. Morrison deployed the landing gear and prayed that the ice would hold. Parker called out airspeed and altitude as they made their final approach. "Airspeed 120, 110, 100. Looking good, Skipper." The big bomber touched down on the ice at 1214 hours, her main landing gear making contact with a tremendous thud that shook the entire aircraft. Morrison reversed the props on the two remaining engines and applied the brakes as gently as possible, knowing that too much braking force could collapse the landing gear or break through the ice. Gremlin's Delight slid across the frozen surface for nearly half a mile before finally coming to rest. The silence that followed was deafening. No engine noise, no wind, just the sound of 14 men breathing sighs of relief. Morrison shut down the remaining engines and sat back in his seat, his hands shaking from the adrenaline and physical strain. They had done the impossible, landed a crippled four-engine bomber with only two engines operating on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere, and everyone had survived. The crew and scientific team slowly unbuckled themselves and began assessing their situation. They were alive, but they were also stranded in sub-zero temperatures with limited survival gear. The radio still worked, and Washington immediately began transmitting their position to rescue coordinators at Ladd Field. Within hours, the first rescue aircraft began arriving overhead. The successful emergency landing had been so remarkable that news of it spread quickly through military aviation circles. Here was proof that skilled pilots and a tough aircraft could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Over the next 3 days, all 14 crew members were safely evacuated by ski-equipped rescue aircraft. Gremlin's Delight was eventually salvaged and her engines examined to determine the cause of the twin failures, a rare coincidence of mechanical problems that should have been fatal. The story of Gremlin's Delight became legendary throughout the U.S. Army Air Forces. It demonstrated the incredible toughness of the B-24 Liberator and the skill of American aircrew in emergency situations. Despite its reputation as a difficult aircraft to fly, the Liberator had proven it could bring its crew home even under the most extreme circumstances. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Parker were both awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions during the emergency. The citation praised their exceptional skill and courage in the face of extreme danger, and noted that their decision to attempt the landing rather than abandon the aircraft had saved 14 lives. The scientific mission was a complete loss. The eclipse observation was abandoned when the engines failed, but Dr. Hamilton later said that witnessing the crew's performance under pressure was more inspiring than any astronomical phenomenon. The dedication and skill of the military aviators made a lasting impression on the civilian scientists. Gremlin's Delight was eventually repaired and returned to service, flying for several more months before the war ended. She was scrapped in 1946 along with thousands of other surplus military aircraft, but her story lived on in Air Force training schools as an example of what could be achieved through skill, determination, and faith. The emergency landing demonstrated several important lessons about aviation survival. First, that proper training and experience could overcome seemingly impossible situations. Morrison and Parker's thousands of hours in the cockpit had prepared them for this moment, even though they had never trained for this specific emergency. Second, it showed the importance of crew coordination during a crisis. Every member of the 14-man crew had played a vital role in the successful outcome, from the flight engineer who feathered the propellers to the navigator who spotted the frozen lake. Finally, it proved that sometimes the most dangerous course of action, continuing to fly rather than bailing out, could actually be the safest option when executed properly. Morrison's decision to attempt the landing saved lives that would have been lost if the crew had jumped into the Alaskan wilderness. The story of Gremlin's Delight became part of B-24 folklore, passed down through generations of military aviators as proof that no situation is truly hopeless if you have the skill, courage, and determination to fight for survival. Today, aviation historians study the incident as an example of exceptional airmanship under extreme conditions. The fact that all 14 crew members survived what should have been a fatal emergency stands as testimony to the legendary toughness of the B-24 Liberator and the extraordinary skill of the men who flew her. In the end, Gremlin's Delight proved that sometimes an aircraft can indeed fly home on nothing more than skill, determination, and a prayer.